Joe, you ready?
I'm ready.
Joe, so let's first talk about who you are, where you come from. Give me the quick Cliff Notes, a brief bio.
All right. My name is Joel Dinerstein. I am born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in the neighborhood of Flatbush. Went to all public schools, including the fabled Erasmus Hall High School. I then went to the State University of New York at Buffalo. Also later taught at Ithaca College. And then I got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, hence all public schools, which is actually a rare thing in academia to have gone to all public schools. I did a lot of different jobs. I spent my 20s trying to be a novelist. Didn't work. Eventually got a PhD in American Studies, studying everything I was trying to write about as a novelist, which is to say blacks, Jews, Brooklyn, white flight, New York, urban issues of all kinds. And then I wound up a professor at Tulane University in New Orleans, where I've been working since 2003. I'm a professor of English and Jewish studies. I mostly teach American literature, and I mostly teach the history of race through literature, which is pretty much what I do. In fact, school starts Monday, and I teach a course every fall called Intro to Fiction, Race and Inclusion. Lastly, I'm the author of 6 books, including my most recent book, the memoir Last of the Ellis Island Jews, which is something of a Valentine, but also a reckoning with my Brooklyn childhood, which I loved. It's about a lot of things, including providing a picture of what an affordable working class family life used to be. That's positive because we don't have those anymore. And I'm talk about other things related to the memoir today, but I'm most known actually for being a world-renowned scholar of the concept of cool. I wrote the first history of the subject called The Origins of Cool in Post-War America. I curated the first museum exhibit called American Cool at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. I also did a corporate project called Coach, a study of New York cool, because Coach, the handbag company, now in what it calls an affordable luxury company, is completely into their New York identity. So I got tapped for that job. And I'm also a jazz scholar and a music scholar. I've written a couple books about jazz. I was a jazz DJ on the New Orleans station WWZ, and that's about all the self-promotion I can do without stopping.
Joe, why the title, Last Jews of Ellis Island?
The last of the Ellis Island Jews.
So my understanding is your parents were Russian, correct?
Yeah.
And they fled, right? And
Yeah.
obviously came to America.
Yeah.
What's their connection with Ellis Island?
So it's direct. They both came in through Ellis Island. So it's called the last of the Ellis Island Jews because I have a very unique position, and to some extent so is my family, which is to say, I'm about as young as you can be, mathematically and biologically, to have a first-generation relationship to Ellis Island.
There you go.
My parents both came in about the age of 10 in 1923. The immigration law changes in 1924, as you might know, because of a decade-long upswelling of anti-immigrant sentiment, much like today, except, and they said the same things, like these groups are ruining America, except it was the Jews and the Italians and the Syrians and the Poles. And so once the law changed and was based on quotas, essentially none of the European Jews immigrated for another 20, 25 years, except for exceptions granted for the Holocaust and escaping Nazi Germany. My parents were native Yiddish speakers. They both grew up in small shtetls, which is the word for village. My mom in Russia, my dad in what is now Lithuania. And they weren't successful. And so we grew up working class. in Flatbush. All my friends were working class. We grew up in apartments. And I thought it was a great childhood, personally. But I also grew up in the midst of white flight. So the reason I
Mm,
wound up being a scholar of race and racism is literally it came out of my experience. There is no way I would have done that if I didn't wind up going to predominantly Black public schools in junior high and high school. And so I was unusually sensitive to racial issues when I was even 13. I can't really explain this beyond the fact that it's true. And I was always asking, like, what is this about? And in fact, when I graduated high school, my family moved to Rego Park in Queens. When I walked away from the apartment for the last day, and I turned the corner from Ocean Avenue onto onto Church Avenue to go to the subway, I literally turned back and asked these two questions. What happened here, and why don't people talk about it? And I meant, race. And I have spent my entire life answering those two questions. So that's pretty much.
interesting.
And so the Ellis Island Jews are us, except my sister and I, who's only a year older than me, we're like, we're as young as you can be and have that. And our family was around us. Like, so I grew up with like 4 generations of people that descended from the Ellis Island migration of Jews,
Interesting.
which people tend to forget account for 75% of all American Jews. 75% are descended from that migration.
Question, Joe, just to get a date and timeline. What was your defining moment in terms of is it the moon landing? Is it the Beatles right coming to Shea Stadium? What was your defining moment in your life? I'll give you an example for me with the 86
Shoot.
Mets.
Yeah.
86 Mets, obviously the Challenger, the sort of accident, right? The space shuttle. Those are things that stand out. Obviously, I know people that said, I remember when Kennedy was assassinated, right? I was already a grown man when 9/11 happened, but obviously another. But I'm talking about as a young boy, right? That said, oh, this is the new world, right?
So that's
what would you say?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think I have one, but in terms of what you said, we'll do a couple. And actually, so there's one chapter in
I'm just
there.
trying to date your time, right?
Yeah,
Because I know
no.
you're young. You're not Brooklyn Dodgers, because Dodgers was 58,
Exactly.
59.
So look, I hadn't
Right?
mentioned that I have a much older brother and sister. My brother's 12 years older than me. My sister's 15 years older than me. My brother was a Dodger guy, right?
Interesting.
Right? Because I'm born in 58 and the Dodgers left in 57.
Correct.
Right? So, but my father was a Yankee fan, so I was a Yankee fan. But I will say a couple of things. So first, in terms of sports, there's a chapter on this. So, in 18 months, we had those great New York City championships, all of which were pretty underdog stories, right? The Mets in 69, the Knicks, and the Jets. Those were huge for me. Like,
okay, got it. All right.
You're
more Joe Namath, right?
Namath was my hero.
Right.
Walt
Namath,
Frazier was my
Seaver,
Frazier,
Willis Reed.
Namath, Frazier, Reed. I mean, the Mets. I was a Yankee fan, but of course, I still rooted for the Mets. So I didn't have a favorite the way I had favorites on the Yankees. I mean, I was a Mickey Mantle guy, even though he was past his prime.
Well, the moon landing too. The moon landing was around that time.
Weirdly, I've never counted the moon landing as that. I mean, I'm 11. We watched it in public school, but I've never really counted that. What I've never thought that much about is the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Sort of really hit me. I mean, I was too young. I remember when JFK was assassinated, but I was 5, right? But I remember literally being in my kitchen when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. I was 10. And I wasn't a political kid, but we were like very much a straight Democratic ticket family. And I was actively rooting for Robert Kennedy. So that was, pretty serious thing. And after that, so, I'm also a total rock and roll kid. I grew up Bob Dylan and Neil Young and Van Morrison and Stevie Wonder fan and all that. And because I went to Erasmus, which was about 80% Black and Afro-Caribbean, outside the gates at 8 o'clock in the morning. First, it was all booming, kind of that Philly soul stuff, and then the Chi-Lites and the Stylistics and all that Quentin Tarantino stuff that he brought back. And then it was all like funk and, or at least sort of funk and chic and LaBelle. So that was all like fairly new to me, but I heard it every day. There's also a lot of reggae on the street. So I heard that a lot too. I would say really outside of my parents', marriage, which was not good, the real serious emotional core of my life was really trying to think about what was happening with race in the 3 years I was in high school. And that meant like all of it. I was a big fan of Black music and graffiti. And like, I'm just sort of like sitting there going, all right, well, here's all this Black culture. And of course, in sports and everything else. And, what's the racism thing? What are these things? So then after that, if the Challenger was big, but I was already totally grown. And to some extent after that, and again, this isn't a moment, really the 80s when Manhattan became more about yuppies and New York became less about working class and middle class neighborhoods, that really hit me because I went away to school and I was traveling for a bit. And then I came back in 84 and I came back and I lived in Brooklyn. I went back to my old neighborhood. I lived with my girlfriend in Flatbush. And I just sort of found Manhattan's transformation into this kind of richer, materialistic yuppie zone, like really upsetting. Like I once almost had an open fight with a guy at a wine bar in Chelsea.
What led you in 84? And I'll get to why 84. You really thought that at that point, 84, Manhattan was already becoming, I mean, you still had a tent city in Tompkins Square Park.
You did.
Still had, I know guys that grew up by Brandeis High School.
Right.
Which is now, I remember during the 80s and 90s, during the crack years, Manhattan Valley was a rough place.
Right.
I'm originally, my family's from the Lower East Side.
All right.
So I remember when Essex, the movie theater was on Essex, right? I've been going to Cat's Deli since I could walk. My parents' first apartment was 55 Delancey.
Nice.
So, I know they came here, my uncle came in the 50s. And Little Italy was where he landed. And Oldbury and my father and mother found their first place. It was 55 Delancey. So what I'm saying, 84 to me was still, oh man.
I mean, maybe it was 85.
Three-card Monty.
Maybe it was 85, 86. I mean, I moved back in 84, but I'll give you these. So first of all, to bring up Tompkins Square, right? When the Tompkins Square tent city happened and then the sort of, riot happened, right? Their main sort of slogan was die yuppie scum, right? People wore that on their t-shirts. So it was something that we were all very aware of. And, one time, as I said, I'm in this wine bar with my girlfriend and her best friend and her boyfriend. And I'm talking to this guy next to me and he's talking about real estate. And he's talking about like flipping buildings and he's talking about the neighborhoods where he's invested. And I'm like arguing. I said, what's going to happen to those neighborhoods? Like, is it all just going to be like, just people who have a lot of money and Manhattan's not going to be like a real city anymore to me? And after he said, I don't care. I'm making money. And like, I literally almost took a swing at him. It's like basically saying, I don't care about the city. I don't care. I don't remember if he was even from the city, but he's basically saying, as long as I'm making money and a lot of it, I don't really care. So then we get to what is really sort of one of the big moments in my life. So in 84, I started teaching in junior high school in Brooklyn, 265 in Fort Greene, on the other side of the BQE.
I know.
On the river side of the BQE. And it was a terrible school. It was run.
My uncle had a place by Farragut houses, by the Navy Yard there.
Right. So this was by the housing projects over there, the DeKalb housing projects, and those were most of our students. And I was a new teacher, and it was a really badly run school. There was no real discipline. There was no real teaching going on. 11 students quit by the end of October. 11 teachers, excuse me.
Wow.
And so when I eventually quit later in the year, I thought a lot about public education. I had a teaching certificate. I wanted to write an article on it. To make a long story short, it became the cover of the Village Voice in August 1985. It was called Diary of a Mad Teacher, which was not my title. And my picture was on the cover. And you know, the Village Voice never put the picture of a writer on the cover. But there I was looking crazy, right? Very noir photo. People didn't even recognize me. But, you know, so I had this cover story, and then it got a lot of play. A lot of teachers were really pissed off about it. And I mean, the letters to the editor were 2-1 against me for saying that no learning happens here. And I explained that I tried and I asked. And I also found out the students most respected the teachers that would hit them. And they said, that doesn't happen. I said, okay, but it was happening, right? So then I sort of I wrote, not next year, like 2 months later, I was on Donahue.
Oh, interesting.
So Donahue did a special show on education. There was a big report in 1984, the Carnegie Report, or Carnegie, as they now say, right, about education. And it was the United States was falling in the world, especially compared to Japan and Germany and other countries. So he put all these teachers in the audience, and I managed to hustle myself on stage. Like, I got the call, they wanted to be one of the teachers in the audience, and I, you know, just hustled myself on stage with the superintendent of the Houston schools and the vice president, I think, of the teachers union, of the National Teachers Union. And so, you know, that went all right. I complained about issues of race and conditions in the public schools. Nobody actually besides me discussed race, discussed the switch that has happened in the schools from being a predominantly female workforce that didn't have a lot of other options until the 70s. So you had the smartest women who became teachers, and then they weren't. Nobody talked, all they talked about was teacher pay, which was really important. And they talked about that they needed merit pay, which was also important. They talked about ESL, but no one spoke about these issues. And then the really important thing that also is one of the highlights is I got invited by New York Newsday, which was then a big newspaper in the United States. In New York. They were Long Island.
Oh, no, I know well. I know, yeah.
And they expanded.
Back then, you even had multiple. Back then, there were multiple papers a day.
Sure. And the New York Newsday, expanded to have a New York edition for about 10 years, and then they gave up the experiment. But during those years, after Donahue and the Voice article, I got asked to do a long article, and I called the article, "Can New York City Schools Be Saved?" And it was almost as long as the Voice article. And what I did is I went back and I interviewed all of my former teachers, because I was a smart kid, and many of them, particularly the math teachers, remembered me because I was on the math team. I was a mathlete. And I asked them what their advice would be to improve the city schools, especially the ones that were underperforming. And I got a lot of answers, and I put it in there. But the most depressing thing I learned is that my high school, Rasmus Hall, in 1969 was about 70% white and Jewish. And then there were race riots in 69 and 70. And within 5 years, it was 80 to 85% Black and Afro-Caribbean and some Latino and Asian, right? That's 4 years. It's almost immediate, right?
What year was Ocean Hill, Brownsville? And that
Ocean Hill, Brownsville, which Albert
Shanker. Albert Shanker was that.
So that's 1968. Right?
Okay.
So
I know
all of this is in the memoir. All of this is sort of a motif in the memoir. So in 68, I talk about that the teacher strike was sort of the beginning of the end of what is a Jewish white flight out of Flatbush, because there's.
But Joe, I want to cut you off because I'm peppering you with these questions because I'm trying to figure this out. Let's take a step back now.
All right.
People say that it really began depending on who you ask, right? So I read that, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning, right?
Yeah,
And
sure.
and obviously they say, you know, the city was bankrupt, and that was the beginning, or according to that author,
Right.
the beginning was then, right? Bushwick became a totally different place, right?
Right.
Arson, you know, I don't have to tell you, you lived it.
Right.
But there are people who make the argument that the real beginning was Robert Moses, the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn, the Giants, you know, baseball west of the Mississippi, the symbolism behind that. A lot of Brooklynites going to suburbia, right? The GI people buying Levittown and the suburban the housing boom right after the war. And that was the beginning, right? Because and here's the other question I want to tie to that, right?
So I don't agree. So I'm going to tell you.
Oh, wait, that's why I want That's why I want you to give me your perspective. The other thing is back to New York City public schools. I think Streisand is Erasmus, right?
Streisand went to my high school.
Erasmus.
Yeah.
Colfax was Lafayette. Colfax was Lafayette. Fred Wilpon, right? Larry King. Humor, Bernie Madoff, right? I mean, we could go down the list. Vince Lombardi, Joe Paterno, name it. They're all, right? Even with Jerry Reinsdorf, Al Davis.
Right.
Jackie Gleason, all right. All of these people are Brooklynites, right?
Yeah.
The question is, what was happening? You talk about the death of the public school system. So there's that wave, right?
Right.
And then you come in, right? Again, that's why I asked you about the Dodgers and where you were with that timeline, right?
Right.
And then you come in and you're in that other mid-60s, late 60s, right? Free love, Vietnam, right? You know what I mean? Beatles and, you know, shaggy hair. But what I'm saying is, what was the beginning? Was it that, or was it the end? The end was the 70s when it was like, oh, that's enough, man. I can't even leave my house without it getting broken into, or my tires are gone when I park my car.
So I'm not a 60s guy, I'm a 70s guy, right? I go to high school in the early 70s. I graduated in 75.
Okay, wow.
So I'm not like a free love Beatles guy.
Okay. Oh, so okay. That's different. Okay. So you are the Bronx is burning then.
Right. To some extent.
Summer of Sam is 70, 78, 77.
I know you know him, so I'll just digress for a second. So I grew up, David Weinraub is my best friend, and we grew up together. And we were together sitting outside his apartment, which was in this sort of low-income housing area in Queens, on the night of the 77 blackout, which is a major event in how this all happens, right? And I remember sitting with him, we were outside and the lights went out. And I said to him, I said, Dave, I think the whole city just went out. And he goes, I guess, like, we're just like looking at darkness, right? We didn't know it was the whole city, but that is what it seemed like. And it was. And that was the night in which looting enters sort of the American vernacular and, you know, all of that. So here's what I say. Part of what you're saying, the old story about Brooklyn ending, right, is not only the Giants and the Dodgers, but people moving to the suburbs for various reasons, whether to have their own home or it wasn't really lower taxes yet, or, you know, to have a better life for their kids, whatever they were thinking, right? And certainly part of that is true. But there's the old story of that it was suburbia and kind of white flight, you know, and sort of a quasi-racist thing in which, you know, Blacks and Latinos move into the neighborhood and people leave. All of that is certainly sociologically partly true. My pushback in the book is this. So
that's what I want to hear.
It really does start in 68. It really does start with the teacher strike. It really is about education. It's not the only thing it's about, but I'm going to tell you what my evidence is for this in a second, right? So the 68 teacher strike happens. And by the way, I spent 6 weeks in the basement of St. Paul's Church where teachers really tried to teach us like everything was normal because the strike lasted 6 weeks. So there was the strike part, and then there was the Black Jewish part. So the New York labor force, the teachers, there was a large, I don't know if it was majority, it was a lot of Jewish teachers on that force, mostly women. Albert Shanker, as you mentioned. And so the problem with Ocean Hill-Brownsville, right, is there was lots of accusations by Jews of Black anti-Semitism and by Blacks of anti-Black racism. And the people who ran the school district in Ocean Hill-Brownsville and a couple other places, they wanted community control so they could teach a sort of both a American history that was closer to the truth and one that came from an African-American perspective or a community perspective, right? So that's part of the fight. But in any case, that fight sparks a great deal of citywide underground dissent and rumbling. So in my neighborhood, when the Erasmus riots happened the following year, that just amps it up and everyone's already ready, right? There are certain neighborhoods that's already happened. Some people have moved, like my parents, from Crown Heights to Flatbush, or they were originally in Bushwick and they moved somewhere else. So the moment those riots happen, everyone is geared to go. And so that's why that turnover in my school happens in 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
So here's the depressing thing, that my two pieces of evidence.
Where do people go?
So that's the evidence, right? So if it was true that people moved to the suburbs, right, then me and my friends would have moved to the suburbs, but we didn't have money to buy houses. So we all moved to other neighborhoods in South Brooklyn and Queens. So my friends moved to Sheepshead Bay, and they moved to Bay Ridge, and they moved to Bayside, and Dave's family moved to Flushing, and my family moved to Rego Park. But that whole thing that we all moved to the suburbs is not really true. Not only that, the Hasidic Jews didn't go anywhere. And in fact, they have only become a much larger part of Brooklyn, and they're not people with a lot of money either. So that whole false narrative to me of apartments to houses does not take into account the evidence of working class families at all, because that's not what happened with us. And so part of why I wrote the book is, in fact, to show that to some extent, to live in a really good, a neighborhood that's alive and vital and has a lot of mom and pop and family businesses, as you might have on the Lower East Side. Like, we were all working from the time we were 13 at like these mom and pop businesses, right? And that you could have a perfectly good life living in an apartment. But in America, we fetishize suburbia and home ownership as if that's how normal people live.
But Joe,
and everyone, yeah.
Joe, but the argument still, the argument there is it's not getting it. It's gotten worse.
Go ahead.
We have the most segregated school system
right
in the country, in New York City.
Right.
Stuyvesant, still the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I think 8 African Americans, 14 Latinos, right? Like, it's, first of all, the fact that there is a separate school system within the public school system via Heck Calandra, meaning the specialized high schools that are run by the state and not by the city, is in itself. And then you don't factor that in with screens.
So I'm with you.
Talented.
Yeah, look, I write in the book that everything I said in that Village Voice article is still pretty much true. Like,
no,
it
but
hasn't,
worse. Worse.
Right. It hasn't changed because everything those teachers said, oh, that doesn't happen, is actually the truth. Then they didn't really want to face it. So either you try to get into what is considered a very good school district, and that's usually determined by income, right? Or you get into the separate school system, as you say. So these problems remain, and they haven't changed. And as long as, quite literally, most white people don't have skin in the game for changing public schools, that's not going to change anywhere in this country.
Interesting. But there's been like District 15, Park Slope.
Right.
They've done like some, we and I could say we, because at that point I was in government. We tried in Forest Hill, South Jamaica. That didn't go anywhere. It's happened with the West Side and parts of Harlem, where the current chancellor was the superintendent at one point. It's all integration. But the fact that we're using the word integration in New York City is bizarre for a public school system.
Look, personally, and I know this is, a take a lot of people wouldn't agree with, but like, I would care less about integration than about the quality of the schools. Like, I don't care if you have an all Black or all Latino school. I don't care. If that school is run well and students are learning It's like, for me at this point, after all these years in which it hasn't turned out well, I'm all for that. I think integration winds up, in this case, not being important anymore. It
But
was at
Joe,
one
but Joe,
time.
but here's the question, right?
Right,
I gave you a whole list
right,
of, right, these Brooklynites
right.
who went on to basically shape sports, culture, name
Yeah,
it.
yeah, everything.
What happened? The only
So,
thing that changed was race,
so two things
right?
happened.
Right? It's
No,
the
no,
same. Eventually, it's the same building, right?
no,
Now there's co-locations, right? But
right,
Erasmus,
right.
you know,
No, so two things happened. One is the race thing. And what I was getting to, which depressed me, is when I wrote that follow-up article, Can New York City Schools Be Saved? I went to interview my favorite professor, Jesse Resnick, who ran the math team. And I asked him what had happened during the race riots at Erasmus. And he said, look, the whole country was going through major racial issues. Like, this is the late 1960s. He goes, it couldn't help but somehow happen in our school. I said, yeah. And I said, go on. And he goes, so after these fights that students had in the hall over race, we invited parents into the school to come see that those were just anomalous disruptions that had to do with national issues. And we went to classes and showed them that our black and white students were learning together and, that they should support it. It's like the learning is still happening. Erasmus was then one of the best schools, highest achieving schools in the city. It was like number 10 or 12. And so I said, what happened? He goes, it's what we would now call confirmation bias. He said, well, they saw what they wanted to see. And he said it really sadly. And I felt really sad because what he's saying is we tried to show them, we were telling them the truth, and they already had decided that they were leaving and that this was, not right for their children. So that's the cap of that story, right? But to go back to what happened, one of the things that happened that to me it's amazing people never talk about, I mentioned this earlier, is that until 1970, pretty much until the women's movement, basically smart women in America had three options. They could be teachers, they could be nurses, they could be secretaries, unless they were anomalous. And most of the smartest ones became teachers. And New York had an amazing amount of smart women who were teachers. They were the core of the workforce. And the workforce was predominantly women. Like, I had brilliant math teachers who were women who I'm sure would have become microbiologists, right? Or actuaries or whatever they became, right? So once women have all the options that men have for careers, they don't want to be low-paying, disrespected teachers because that's what we've done in America. And so we lose the core of the workforce that held it together. And to my surprise, no one ever really talks about it in this way. They talk about it almost as a positive that women had more options, but I'm not saying it's the women's fault. It's our fault because America and New York didn't compensate by, say, paying more money or trying to compensate for the fact that most of the women who had made up their workforce were now not going to be part of their workforce.
Got it. Joe, we have 5 minutes.
All right.
What do you want from someone? What's the takeaway from reading your book? And does someone walk away saying, you know what, factually accurate, right? I agree, but I've lost all hope.
Well, I'm not sure I can. I mean, I end on a hopeful note, even though I'm fairly pessimistic given our current government and administration. But what I want, here's what I want. So partly my book is about American Jewish identity and I don't make any prescriptions about where I'd like to see it go, but I want to see it more focused back on the United States and not on Israel and not on the Holocaust. So I make that argument in a subtle way. But the second thing I really want is that, so we all talk about affordability now, right? And, as I said earlier, when we were growing up, a working class family could afford to live in New York City in a decent neighborhood with decent public schools in a 5-room apartment, right? And it wasn't half their income, and this could be done. And, you know, and I don't even think we know what that looks like anymore. So I wanted to provide, I mean, I know lots has changed. I'm not saying we can revive it, but with all the talk of affordability and all of what Bernie Sanders and AOC have to say, I wanted to say, this is what that looked like. And it was a pretty good life. And I loved it, right? And so when I talk about my childhood and when I went to graduate school, people would say, you sound like you had a mythic childhood. And I don't know what they were talking about until now. It's like, it wasn't mythic, but it was unique and vibrant and vital. And they're saying, everybody thinks suburban upbringings, they may be nice, but they're dull. It's like, you didn't have a dull upbringing in a New York City that used to have vital working and middle-class neighborhoods. And so that's really what I want people to take away from it.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this, and I appreciate it. It was fun. It was fun. I want to talk about cool at some point.
I would love to come back and just talk about cool.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
That's a political thing too in itself.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Roberto. Enjoy your weekend.